In 2018, a little-known republic nestled deep in the heart of Central Asia devised what appeared to be a brilliant strategy to halt the widespread exodus of skilled and educated workers, a challenge that afflicts many developing nations worldwide. Its solution was straightforward. It simply stopped allowing anyone to leave, effectively transforming the entire country into a virtual prison twice the size of the United Kingdom. Indeed, Turkmenistan touts itself as a nation of pragmatic solutions. That same year, then-President Berdimuhamedov, attributing bad luck to the presence of black cars, banned their importation. Soon citizens across the country began waking up to find that their cars had vanished overnight, having been towed away by the authorities. To get them back, owners were forced to pay for a repaint, often at unaffordable prices. Before long, this unusual mandate was extended to include all colored cars. Hence, should you ever find yourself scanning satellite images of Turkmenistan, you'll be met with a monochromatic sea of white vehicles, which just so happens to be the former president's favorite color. But Berdimuhamedov's eccentricities pale in comparison to his predecessor, Niyazov, self-titled as His Excellency, the great leader of the Turkmen and God's prophet on earth. In a grandiose display of concern for his nation's health, Niyazov carved a colossal 37-kilometer staircase into the Kopet Dag mountain range. He mandated that politicians climb it yearly in a so-called health walk, while he watched from above in a helicopter, before chastising them at the finish line for their slow pace. The array of bewildering decrees issued by Turkmenistan's leaders appears limitless. Days of the week, months of the year, breeds of horses, and even craters on the moon have been personally renamed to the preferences of whichever leader is in charge at the time. At one point, Niyazov literally renamed bread after his mother. Another bizarre incident saw him advise citizens to chew on bones to enhance dental health, citing the absence of dogs in dental offices as his justification. Dogs, however, have become scarce in the capital on account of them being banned for their, quote, unappealing odor. This prohibition is just one of many in a relentless series of efforts over the last 3 decades aimed at transforming the capital city into an immaculate, pristine, and grand vision of a dictator's personal paradise. Vast neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble to make way for a breathtaking number of skyscrapers, monuments, parks, stadiums, and palaces, each crafted from impeccable Italian marble, and then lined with gold. So much marble has been used to build the city that it earned it a Guinness World Record, along with the largest indoor pool, the largest indoor Ferris wheel, the largest architectural star, and the most fountain pools in a public space, an irony given the country's severe water scarcity. But beyond the grandeur of its gleaming marble city and the often comical antics of its leaders, little about Turkmenistan is amusing for those forced to live within its borders. In August 2023, a distressing scene unfolded in the extensive cotton fields of Turkmenistan's Lebap province. Beneath the sweltering heat, exceeding 104 degrees Fahrenheit, tens of thousands toiled tirelessly by hand to gather the annual cotton harvest. While the sight of diligent laborers in cotton fields is not by itself unusual, the composition of this workforce was anything but ordinary. Instead of seasonal agricultural workers, this vast sea of labor comprised teachers, doctors, lawyers, flight attendants, state workers, and even school children, none of whom were there by choice or paid. Under a presidential decree, both state agencies and private companies forced half of their staff to pick cotton during the week, with full participation required on weekends. Facing the risk of public humiliation and job loss, a daunting prospect in a country with a staggering 70% unemployment rate, workers reluctantly complied as they struggled to meet their daily cotton quota of 55 pounds. Ever since gaining independence from the Soviet Union, Turkmenistan's leaders have painstakingly reinstated Stalinist rule. Today, the country stands as one of the last true totalitarian dictatorship. Secret police resort to torture and use psychotropic drugs against political opponents. Those labeled as enemies of the state are publicly paraded on live television, coerced into confessions, and forced to beg for mercy to spare their families from similar fates. Afterwards, they vanish without a trace. Mere criticism of the government, in any form, is deemed treasonous, often resulting in lengthy prison sentences, confinement to psychiatric facilities, or exile to the desolate salt flats by the Caspian Sea. The level of repression is so extreme that last year, Turkmenistan was ranked as the second worst country in the world for freedom, a position even lower than Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, war-torn Eritrea, and the infamous North Korea. But with the transition of power from Berdimuhamedov to his son in 2022, marking Central Asia's first hereditary succession since the era of the Khans, hope for improvement in the near future has all but been extinguished. It's hardly surprising, then, that many are desperate to leave in search of a better life elsewhere, assuming the government does not successfully stop them first. But how did Turkmenistan become such a dystopian nightmare? How do its leaders maintain such an absolute grip on power? And where does the seemingly endless supply of money that sustains the regime come from? This is the story of Turkmenistan, the strangest dictatorship in the world. On September 9, 1879, Russian military forces began a severe bombardment of Gyeongtepe, a city encircled by a formidable wall made out of mud, 18 feet thick and 10 feet tall, sheltering 40,000 Turkmen. Despite their technological advantages, the Russian troops, limited in number and supplies, suffered heavy losses in their frontal assault on the city, forcing a strategic retreat to their base on the Caspian Sea. Driven by objectives to secure its southern frontier, advance its economic interests, and enhance its global stature, Russia had been gradually expanding its dominion over Central Asia. But the humiliating defeat at Gyeongtepe marked Russia's first major setback in its imperial goals in 164 years. Located at the southern fringe of Central Asia, Gyeongtepe was located in what is today modern Turkmenistan. The area was primarily inhabited by nomadic tribes who roamed the extensive Karakum Desert, subsisting on livestock herding and raiding passing trade caravans. Despite the harshness of their existence, these tribes gained a reputation for their fierce resistance to external powers and their involvement in the slave trade, a brutal reality that some of the encroaching Russians experienced firsthand. Recognizing Gyeongtepe's strategic importance for conquering the rest of the region, Russia began a more calculated second attack, 2 years after their initial defeat. On January 12, 1881, they detonated a tunnel packed with thousands of kilograms of explosives beneath the city's wall. This created a 140-foot wide breach in the city's defenses, enabling Russian forces to flood in. Following a ruthless massacre of the city's residents, the rest of Central Asia soon fell to the Tsar. Over the next 4 decades, Russia made little effort to assimilate the region or its inhabitants into the empire. Although railroads expanded and new cities like Ashgabat emerged, spurred by an influx of Russian migrants, the region's predominantly desert terrain, making up 90% of its geography, hindered any real development. By the eve of World War I, the industrial sector remained modest, comprising only a few cotton gins, leather processing facilities, and a single steam engine manufacturing plant. By 1916, amidst the escalating challenges of a war turning against him, Tsar Nicholas II made the controversial decision to conscript Turkestani Muslims, who had until then been exempt from military service. This decision, combined with a corrupt and oppressive local government, ignited widespread revolts across Central Asia, further fueled by the Russian Revolution the following year. For 8 years, the region was engulfed in severe turmoil, featuring a mix of warfare, revolution, famine, and devastating reforms. Eventually, the Soviet Union emerged from the ashes of the Russian Empire, forcefully bringing Central Asia along in its socialist transformation. By 1924, the last major remnants of resistance had been crushed, and Central Asia was reorganized into distinct ethno-national political entities. Among these, the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic was formally established. In line with sweeping changes occurring across the Union, the state confiscated all land, and forcibly integrated the nomadic population into state-run and collective farms. Concurrently, the government introduced a standardized Turkmen written language and established numerous publishing houses and schools. These initiatives were designed to boost literacy rates, reduce intertribal conflicts, and align the population with Soviet ideals. These measures, together with the violent suppression of political dissent, transformed Turkmenistan into a docile, isolated, and largely overlooked republic within the Soviet sphere. Despite this, several key developments heavily influenced its evolving character. The first of these occurred during the Second World War. As German armies captured significant parts of the Soviet Union's industrial heartland, Many industries were relocated to safer locations, including Central Asia. Turkmenistan received 2 oil processing plants from Azerbaijan, a metal processing plant from southern Russia, and approximately 24 textile plants. However, due to limited infrastructure and an underdeveloped energy sector, these developments were relatively modest compared to the other republics. Following the war, Turkmenistan remained under-industrialized due to a policy of regionalization. This policy allocated distinct economic roles to each republic based on their unique resources, geographical advantages, and workforce capabilities, all aimed at enhancing the Soviet Union's collective economic performance. More importantly, though, it deliberately made each republic dependent on the others. For Turkmenistan, this meant becoming one of the Union's leading producers of natural gas, cotton, and sheep. By 1950, around 70% of the country's population was employed in the agricultural sector, producing 15% of the Union's cotton, a significant amount of caracal wool, and 50 billion cubic feet of natural gas annually. In contrast to other republics, Turkmenistan experienced little in migration, and its comparatively sparse population and extensive landscape posed a challenge for economic modernization. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, an enormous window of opportunity opened. Unlike other former Soviet republics, Turkmenistan boasted a wealth of resources and potential. Among these were substantial reserves of natural gas, along with significant oil deposits and the expansive Karakum Desert, well suited for large-scale cotton farming. This immense resource wealth and unique geography had the potential to transform Turkmenistan into a prosperous and influential nation on the world stage. However, the challenge of converting this potential into reality was significant, necessitating effective leadership and strategic planning. This task fell to Saparmurat Niyazov, a former party bureaucrat and first secretary of the Communist Party of the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, who swiftly assumed absolute power in the newly independent nation. Rising to power in a manner akin to many ex-communists across the former Soviet Union, Niyazov was elected to the presidency in a largely uncontested race, having been endorsed by his predecessor. Leveraging his firm control over the media and security services, Niyazov effectively silenced political opposition, and in June 1992, presided over the adoption of a new constitution. This granted him unchecked authority, and his iron grip over the country remained unchallenged for the next 15 years. Although Niyazov initially entertained the notion of transforming Turkmenistan into a Dubai-like commercial hub and liberalizing the economy, by 1994, it was clear that his vision had taken a turn for the bizarre. Obsessed with establishing a distinct national identity, Niyazov set about creating a personal cult of personality. He renamed himself Turkmenbashi, which translates to Father of the Turkmen. The names of months, days of the week, and various public institutions were changed to honor him and his mother. He commissioned grandiose gold statues of himself across the country, including one that rotated to always face the sun in the capital. The city itself underwent a dramatic transformation, with neighborhoods demolished to make way for his new vision, comprising parks, stadiums, palaces, and other monumental structures, all constructed from the finest Italian marble. Yet, while Niyazov's monumental construction projects gave the capital an impressive facade, they masked the underlying reality of a nation grappling with severe issues. The stark rural poverty, a stagnant economy, and an administration rife with corruption and nepotism posed significant challenges. Moreover, the lavish spending on grandiose projects often came at the expense of essential services and public welfare. Despite the nation's abundant natural gas reserves, most of the population continued to endure power shortages, inadequate healthcare, and a lack of basic amenities. Furthermore, Niyazov's policies stifled economic progress and innovation. By clinging to a centralized, authoritarian model of governance, he created an environment where critical thinking and entrepreneurship were stifled, and dissent was harshly punished. The lack of economic diversification and reliance on a single resource further compounded these challenges, making Turkmenistan highly vulnerable to fluctuations in the global energy market. Despite these issues, the centralized control allowed Niyazov to maintain stability and prevent major civil unrest. His sudden death in 2006 marked the end of an era, but the transition of power to his successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, indicated a continuation of the authoritarian regime. Berdimuhamedov initially rolled back some of Niyazov's most eccentric policies and appeared to promise a more pragmatic approach. However, he soon established his own personality cult and continued many of his predecessors' policies. Under Berdimuhamedov, Turkmenistan's capital underwent further development, with additional marble structures, parks, and monuments. The government's focus on grand projects continued, often at the expense of addressing the pressing needs of the population. Like his predecessor, Berdimuhamedov prioritized maintaining tight control over the state and suppressing dissent. The use of forced labor, as seen in the cotton fields, persisted, and the regime's heavy-handed tactics continued to stifle any form of political opposition. The hereditary transition of power to Berdimuhamedov's son in 2022 indicated that the regime was unlikely to change its approach. This further entrenched the autocratic governance, leaving little room for hope among the populace. As Turkmenistan remains one of the most repressive and isolated countries in the world, the path to a more open and prosperous future appears uncertain. The regime's focus on maintaining power and control, coupled with the exploitation of its natural resources, continues to shape the nation's trajectory. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, Turkmenistan faced an economic crisis. The nation's economic output dwindled to less than half of its 1991 level. The fundamental issue facing Turkmenistan was the mismatch between its political independence and its economic autonomy. Stemming from the Soviet policy of regionalization, the country lacked the capability to refine its raw resources and the infrastructure to sell its goods outside of Russia. This economic isolation is highlighted by the lack of even a railway link to neighboring Iran, despite its lands being just 15 miles from Ashgabat. Consequently, Turkmen gas and cotton could only be transported, sold, and processed through Russia. Amid these constraints, Russia exploited Turkmenistan's dependency by purchasing these commodities at significantly lower prices than those on the international market, paying with hard currency for only 50% of this already reduced value. The remainder was frequently paid in goods such as grain, and sometimes, not at all. To further enhance its profit margins, Gazprom, Russia's state-owned energy giant and the exclusive buyer of Turkmen gas, strategically limited its purchases to 11 billion cubic meters per year, merely an eighth of Turkmenistan's pre-independence production levels. In 1997, the situation became dire as former Soviet republics, grappling with financial constraints, halted their gas payments entirely. Confronted with outstanding payments amounting to a staggering 80% of its GDP, Turkmenistan ceased gas exports entirely. Consequently, gas exports stood at just 10% of their pre-independence levels. Meanwhile, cotton production suffered a catastrophic 50% decline. The lack of hard currency severely restricted the import of essential supplies like fertilizers, tractors, and cotton-picking machines, crippling the agricultural sector. This crisis was exacerbated by Niyazov's policy of making water free for citizens and farmers, which removed incentives for its efficient use, leading to severe water shortages and a 43% drop in output per acre over 7 years. With both of its key industries in ruins, the population's living standards began to deteriorate, threatening the stability of the regime. But the solution to these challenges was surprisingly simple. The country needed to access global markets by building alternative natural gas pipelines and railroads to bypass Russia's monopsony, a monopoly on the demand side of a market. Developing such infrastructure would bring in a surge of hard currency, which could then be strategically used to address input shortages and establish value-added industries for its raw resources. In 1996, the first rail connection with Iran was established, providing access to the Persian Gulf. The following year, a 125-mile pipeline was built to connect Turkmenistan's gas fields to Iran's remote northeast. Despite its modest annual capacity of 4 billion cubic meters, actual exports seldom reached even a third of this capacity, also hindered by Iran's ability to make payments. Building on these initial developments, a more ambitious proposal surfaced: a pipeline intended to transport 33 billion cubic meters of gas over 1,000 miles to Pakistan and India. But the route's need to traverse Taliban-controlled Afghanistan ultimately made the project unfeasible. A more promising proposal was the Trans-Caspian pipeline, intended to transport gas beneath the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan and Georgia, to Turkey, and onward to Western Europe. Yet, maritime disputes with Azerbaijan, stalled negotiations over transit fees, and financing issues indefinitely postponed the project. Despite these setbacks, the discussions led to significant diplomatic outcomes, including a meeting between Niyazov and U.S. President Bill Clinton. These talks focused on energy deals and strategies for accessing global markets without depending on routes through Iran or Russia. Although these plans faltered as well, they were enough to compel Russia to sign a far more favorable gas agreement with Turkmenistan, driven by concerns over losing its influence over the country and the broader region. As the volume and value of gas exports to Russia skyrocketed, Turkmenistan's persistent trade deficit turned into a surplus by the year 2000. This turnaround was complemented by efforts to construct modern textile factories, repurpose farmland for domestic food production, and renovate an old Soviet oil refinery. These initiatives collectively fueled an enormous economic boom, positioning Turkmenistan as one of the fastest-growing economies on the planet. As the new century dawned, Niyazov would leverage these surging revenues and his extraordinary political strength to usher in his own personal utopia, a dictator's marble paradise. On December 28, 1999, a newly elected parliament, composed solely of candidates handpicked by Niyazov, bestowed upon him the title of President for Life. Liberated from the need to even fake fair elections, Niyazov began to fully act upon his grandiose delusions. Assuming the role of the spiritual and cultural arbiter of the Turkmen nation, Niyazov banned ballets, operas, beards, and cinemas for being insufficiently Turkmen, and closed all schools offering education in foreign languages. Additionally, he demanded that all state employees prove Turkmen racial purity traceable back 3 generations, prompting a mass exodus of the highly skilled Russian population. Following a personal health scare involving heart issues, Niyazov banned public smoking and constructed the infamous 37-kilometer Walk of Health, mandating that Turkmen citizens and politicians complete it annually. In 2001, he introduced his 400-page Ruhnama, a pseudo-national Bible that emphasized Turkmen nationalism. Within its pages, Niyazov was depicted as a godlike figure who saved the nation from Soviet imperialism and was destined to usher in an era of prosperity. Initially dominating the shelves of bookstores and the desks of state offices, the Ruhnama soon became required in mosques and churches, placed alongside every Quran and Bible. Its teachings were then integrated into the national education system, becoming not just compulsory reading but the central component of the curriculum. Prisoners were forced to swear an oath on it for release, doctors had to pledge their allegiance to it, and drivers, teachers, and civil servants were all forced to pass examinations on its content. Those caught criticizing the book, even privately, faced up to 5 years in prison. As Niyazov's assertions about the Ruhnama grew increasingly bizarre, he declared that reading the book 3 times would guarantee entry into heaven. Then, in a symbolic gesture of its supposed universal significance, a copy of the Ruhnama was even launched into orbit, intended to conquer space. The book thus became the linchpin of a now perfected brainwashing apparatus. Across radio, television, and newspapers, the Turkmenbashi, his family background, and his various supposed achievements were incessantly praised. Every broadcast began with the ominous pledge that the broadcaster's tongue will shrivel if he slanders the country, flag, or president. The cult of personality surrounding Niyazov reached such extremes that days, months, and even bread were renamed in honor of him, his mother, the Ruhnama, and other symbols of Turkmen nationalism. His image saturated public and private spaces alike, displayed in enormous portraits and statues across the country, and on every banknote, coin, and postage stamp. Even airplane cabins and passenger trains were required to feature his portrait, ensuring a constant, omnipresent reminder of his rule. But Niyazov's most ambitious endeavor was the transformation of Ashgabat into a testament to his wealth and power. Ignoring the potential for these vast gas revenues to improve the general welfare, he chose instead to import Italian marble for the construction of lavish monuments, gigantic mosques, luxury apartments, and gold-domed palaces for himself. Additionally, billions were blown on seemingly whimsical projects like an enormous desert lake that quickly evaporated, extravagant fountain displays, zoos with Arctic animals, and a towering 250-foot arch topped with a golden statue of himself that rotated with the sun. In a striking example of excess, the city's main avenue was lined with 22 five-star hotels in a country that rarely allows visitors. To accommodate these prestige projects, entire neighborhoods were demolished, often without offering compensation or adequate alternative housing to the displaced residents. Hidden behind the unaffordable marble apartments, growing slums were filled with windowless, single-room homes, some crudely fashioned from old railway containers that baked during the scorching summers. Many inhabitants of these areas succumbed to opium addiction, a situation worsened by the unchecked influx of drugs from neighboring Afghanistan. In rural areas, remnants of Soviet-era policies persisted, with forced and child labor still prevalent in the cotton fields, creating a stark contrast between the opulent displays of wealth and the harsh realities faced by the general populace. But resistance to Niyazov's regime from the general population remained virtually non-existent. Despite the widespread unemployment and low wages that plagued the economy, free gas, electricity, and water along with heavily subsidized prices for food and other essentials helped to quell discontent. This, coupled with relentless propaganda and a pervasive climate of fear, effectively stifled any grassroots opposition. But the situation escalated dramatically on the morning of November 25, 2002, when Niyazov's motorcade was ambushed, leading to a deadly shootout. This failed assassination and coup attempt triggered a sweeping purge of the political elite and citizens alike. Hundreds of individuals and their families were subjected to show trials, received lengthy prison sentences, and subsequently vanished without a trace. In an atmosphere thick with paranoia, informers were recruited to eavesdrop on private conversations, psychotropic drugs were used to torture detainees, and roadblocks were established every few miles as a permanent measure. Car radios were banned to reduce background noise during surveillance, and all public gatherings, including weddings and funerals, now needed government approval. Further restrictions limited citizens' ability to leave the country, notably prohibiting women under 35 from traveling abroad unless they had 2 children, framed as a duty to perpetuate the Turkmen race. With his rule more secure than ever, Niyazov refocused his efforts on executing even more extravagant projects. Among these was the Turkmenbashi Palace in Awaza, a gleaming white marble edifice that cost over $1.4 billion, and a state-of-the-art medical center, complete with the world's tallest hospital. This facility, located in Ashgabat, aimed to provide world-class healthcare and featured a fully integrated system for telemedicine, allowing for consultations with specialists from around the globe. His health plans also included the distribution of free pharmaceuticals and the establishment of a network of clinics throughout the country. Additionally, the Golden Age Lake, a massive artificial reservoir in the Karakum Desert, sought to revolutionize the country's agriculture by providing a reliable source of irrigation. In tandem with these projects, Niyazov directed funds towards the development of a national airline, Turkmenistan Airlines, which quickly expanded its fleet and established international routes, aiming to connect the country more effectively to the global economy. On December 21, 2006, after enduring 20 years of his unchallenged rule, Niyazov finally died of a heart attack. The news of his death sent shockwaves throughout the country, leading to an unprecedented outpouring of grief and uncertainty about the future.